everybody, Rachel here. Today I'm going to talk about the Tuskegee Syphilis study because it's a horrifyingly racist chapter in the history of the United States and public health, and we all need to know that it happened. The Tuskegee Syphilis study was started in 1932 by the United States Public Health Service to examine the natural history of syphilis. I'll get into syphilis in another video, but briefly, it's a bacterial infection that is spread through sexual contact. It's plagued humanity for hundreds of years, and if not treated, can cause blindness, dementia, seizures, stroke, and death in up to 58% of cases. For much of the history of syphilis, there was no real effective cure, although doctors did treat patients with mercury and other toxic substances in an attempt to cure it. The first actually effective treatment for syphilis was a medicine called salvarsan, developed in 1909, although it caused significant side effects and was difficult to store and administer. Luckily, when penicillin was developed, it was discovered that it treated syphilis extremely well, with few side effects, and it became the main treatment for syphilis by 1947. Make a note of those dates. Before the Tuskegee syphilis study began, some doctors believed that syphilis progressed differently in Black people than in white people, that white people were more likely to develop neurological symptoms, while Black people were more likely to sustain cardiovascular damage. So Tolliver Clark, the head of the U.S. Public Health Service at the time, decided to do a prospective observational study to see if this was true. A previous study had been done in white men in Norway, but that one had been retrospective, gathering the data on a group of men who had syphilis and looking backward at suspected risk factors and the progression of the disease. Nonetheless, Clark decided to use the Norway study basically as a control for his new study. And if you've watched my video on double blinding, you're probably already seeing problems with this. The original plan was to have the observational phase of the study last for 6 months to 1 year, and then follow up with a treatment phase, since, after all, there already was available salvarsan, an effective treatment for syphilis. Since syphilis is, to put it mildly, extremely dangerous, simply withholding treatment for 6 months to a year is unethical enough. But oh, it's going to get so much worse than that. Researchers in the U.S. Public Health Service decided to use Macon County, Alabama as the site of the study at the urging of Dr. Thomas Perrin. A big part of the reason for placing the study there was that Macon County was the site of the Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. The USPHS and the on-site study director, Raymond A. Vondelaire, reasoned that they would be able to get support from the Tuskegee Institute, and they were right. Both Robert Moten, then the head of the Institute, and Dr. Eugene Dibble, the head of the Institute's hospital, gave their endorsements and institutional support. Getting this buy-in from leaders in the community was crucial in getting people to enroll in the study. It's unclear how much these Black leaders knew about the actual workings of the study. A nurse named Eunice Rivers was also recruited to be the main point of contact with the participants and the link to the community. The participants loved her and called the study clinic Miss Rivers Lodge. She was the only study staff person who was with the participants for the full 40 years. That's right, this study lasted 40 years. In 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis study enrolled 600 Black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. This diagnosis happened at the intake examination. The men received free physical exams, rides to and from the clinic, hot meals on exam days, treatment for minor ailments, and burial insurance. But they were not told that the study would simply be an observational study. Instead, they were lied to and told that they would receive treatment for bad blood, which was a local term used to describe several different ailments, including syphilis, but also anemia and fatigue. Since most of the men were sharecroppers, I am pretty sure they were all suffering from fatigue. But the men who were diagnosed with syphilis at the intake examinations weren't even told of that diagnosis. During the course of the study, the USPHS gave the men placebos, ineffective treatments, and diagnostic procedures such as spinal taps, all the while telling them that they were actually treatments. In order to get the men to consent to the spinal taps, the USPHS sent out misleading letters titled "Last Chance for Special Free Treatment." Local physicians were asked to assist with the study by not treating the men for syphilis if they presented to them as patients, and they complied. During World War II, many of the men reported for military service, and in the normal course of things would have been diagnosed with syphilis and treated. However, the USPHS managed to prevent them from getting treatment for or even diagnosed with their syphilis even then. And, as I mentioned before, penicillin became the standard of treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, and these men should have been treated with it, but instead they still didn't even know that they had syphilis. Remember, syphilis is spread through sexual contact. As a result of this study, 40 of the participants' wives contracted syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis, where the disease is contracted inside the uterus. The first clinical data from the Tuskegee syphilis study was published in 1934, with the first major report coming in 1936. This was already after the study should have been shifted into the treatment phase, when the men should have been receiving treatment for their syphilis. But the USPHS lost the funding for the treatment phase, and Raymond A. Vondelaire decided to simply continue the observational phase. He retired in 1943, but the study continued, eventually being transferred over to being run by the Centers for Disease Control. This study was not secret. Data sets and reports were published in the medical literature throughout its duration. Think about how many people had to have read those reports and thought, we have an effective treatment for syphilis, but these men aren't receiving it. That's A-okay by me. Luckily, not everybody felt that way. In 1955, Count D. Gibson, an associate professor at the Medical College of Virginia, expressed ethical concerns to the USPHS. And in 1965, Irwin Schatz, a young doctor in Chicago, read one of the reports and wrote to the report's authors saying that the study was brazenly unethical. Both of them were ignored. Then, Peter Buxton, a social worker and epidemiologist working for the USPHS in San Francisco, filed an official protest in 1965 on ethical grounds, but it was rejected on the grounds that the study wasn't completed yet, which I can't even. He filed another protest in 1968, pointing out the political volatility of the study. This was after the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination, but his concerns were ruled irrelevant. In fact, after this, the CDC reaffirmed the need to continue the study to its completion, that is, until all of the participants had died and been autopsied, and they received unequivocal support for this continuation from the local chapters of the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association, which represents, or is supposed to, African American physicians and their patients. Fed up with this response, Peter Buxton leaked information about the study to a reporter named Jean Heller for the Washington Star, and she published the story on July 25, 1972. It became front-page news in the New York Times the next day, and due to the subsequent public outcry, congressional hearings were called, and an ad hoc advisory panel was appointed to review the study. The panel concluded that the study was ethically unjustified, and that the knowledge gained was sparse when compared with the risks the study posed to its subjects. Finally, in November 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study was stopped, 40 years after it began. By this time, only 74 of the participants were still alive. Of the 399 who had been diagnosed with syphilis at the start of the study, 28 had died directly from syphilis, with another 100 of related complications. In the summer of 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed by the NAACP on behalf of the participants and their descendants, and an out-of-court settlement was reached of $10 million in 1974. As part of this settlement, the United States government promised to give lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all living participants, and this was expanded in 1975 to include wives, widows, and offspring. And in 1997, President Clinton formally apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis study on behalf of the nation, with 5 of the 8 survivors attending the ceremony: Charlie Pollard, Herman Shaw, Clint Howard, Fred Simmons, and Frederick Moss. I've put a link to the apology in the show notes. I found it quite powerful. It's impossible to overstate how unethical this study was. And it didn't even produce any meaningful scientific results, not even within its own unethical parameters. It was supposed to follow the participants with untreated syphilis, but many of the participants received treatment at the study clinic with mercury rubs and bismuth, which were minimally effective but still treatments. It's also impossible to say that it wasn't racist. The researchers who led the study assumed, with no evidence, that Black people were more susceptible to venereal diseases than white people, and they went ahead with the study anyway. They also assumed, again with no evidence, that Black people weren't likely to seek out medical treatment, when in reality, the promise of medical treatment was what secured the cooperation of many of the subjects in the study. One good thing has come out of the reaction to this study and others like it. The way that public health and clinical studies are run today is very different from the way they were run when the Tuskegee syphilis study began. Informed consent is now mandatory, and institutional review boards, which include lay people as well as scientists and doctors, review study protocols, protect patients' interests, and ensure that all participants are fully informed. But some of that was true before, or at least during, the Tuskegee syphilis study. After all, the study continued even after the revelations about the concentration camps after World War II, the Nuremberg Code, and the World Health Organization Declaration of Helsinki in 1965, which already specified the need for informed consent. And just the fact of having informed consent and IRBs doesn't mean we get to abdicate our responsibility to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. Some studies have shown that because of the Tuskegee syphilis study, the trust of the African American community in U.S. public health efforts has been significantly damaged, and that makes perfect sense. A 2016 paper even suggested that because of the revelations about this study, life expectancy at age 45 for Black men fell by 1.4 years because of a decrease in outpatient and inpatient physician interactions with older Black men. It's important to know about horrors like the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it's even more important to talk about them. This study is one part of the framework in which the current unrest is happening, and it's an important part. We can't forget about what we did. We can't ever let it happen again. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and you think you'll be interested in more videos about public health, click like and subscribe. Thank you. I hope to see you soon.